Good evening, everybody. I'm Dan Schluffman. I'm the chairman of the Jewish Community Relations Committee of the Jewish Federation of Northern New Jersey. Welcome to the first of 3 parts of a wonderful program. The Jewish Community Relations Council, or the JCRC, represents the New Jersey Jewish community in governmental affairs, dealing with other ethnic groups and religious communities, as well as the news media. We work with local Jewish organizations to build a stronger New Jersey Jewish community, and we partner with other area communities and organizations to ensure the continuing vitality of the Jewish people in the New Jersey area. At this point, I'm going to turn the program over to one of our 2 chairs. It's Donna Weintraub is one of the chair, and Wendy Ward. Donna is a board member of the Jewish Federation. She's been a Berry Fellow. She and Wendy have worked very hard to put together a phenomenal program. I know that you guys are going to love it. So without further ado, Donna Weintraub.
Thank you, Dan. Oops, sorry. Thank you, Dan. As Dan said, I'm very active at Federation. I'm a member of the Board of Trustees of the Jewish Federation of Northern New Jersey, the president of our Federation's Women's Philanthropy Board, and co-chair of this very important 3-part series, Raising Consciousness and Anti-Racism and the Jewish Community. Welcome and thank you for joining us. Jewish tradition and Jewish values teach that God created us all in the divine image equally, and that we must always stand up for the other. The Jewish community in the United States has a long and proud history of involvement in social justice movements. Our community overwhelmingly supports the idea of racial equality, but the question remains, how do we actively engage to help bring about sustainable change? Today is the first of a 3-part series to help us all answer this question. As Mitch Albom said recently in one of his articles, you can't separate one hate from all hate any more than you can separate a breeze from the wind. To make progress in this area, we need to listen and learn, and really listen, hoping that in time we will begin to understand various forms of hate and bias directed toward the Black community, both institutional and social, and hopefully step in and step up to help bring about sustainable change. I'm very excited to be introducing our presenters for this evening's program. Cheryl Green Rosario is a visionary leader with over 25 years of experience in corporate social responsibility, ensuring diversity, equity, and inclusion, working with Fortune 500 companies, family foundations, and nonprofit organizations. Cheryl recently started her own philanthropy consulting business. Vivian Hochster is president of Aviva Strategic Advising LLC, a management consulting firm focused on diversity and inclusion for nonprofits and foundations. She has worked extensively in the Jewish nonprofit world with national organizations including Sharsheret, Young Judea, and Pardes. Both Cheryl and Vivian are happy to take questions after tonight's presentation. Please feel free to use the question and answer feature at the bottom of your screen, and we will share those questions with the speakers throughout the program. Thank you for joining us, and welcome Cheryl and Vivian.
Thank you so much, Donna, and thanks to all of you who have joined us tonight. As Donna mentioned, I'm Cheryl Green Rosario, and I'm so glad to be a part of this important discussion. A big thank you to Donna Weintraub, Wendy Ward, and Ariella Novak for inviting me and Vivian Hochster to this important conversation. So I know Donna gave you a little bit of information about my bio. I also thought it would be important tonight to share a little bit why this work is so important to me. So growing up as a fair-skinned Black little girl in Southern Virginia, I remember the stories of my parents, especially of my father, talking about his walking to school, and he wasn't able to get on the bus. But if it was the winter, he would hear the children from the bus, white children, calling him derogatory names, or maybe having snowballs thrown at him. He always reminded me to feel very fortunate that I had a place to go to school and could ride the bus free of that type of racism. I'm also working on a book and have done some writings about my experience as a fair-skinned Black woman and seeing racism firsthand. So let's talk about what we will explore together this evening. First, why are we here? We'll take a look at the Black experience. Why should we care about the history of Black-Jewish relations? Why have the Black and Jewish experiences been so different? How did the civil rights movement influence Judaism in America? What does Black Lives Matter reveal about the Black-Jewish relations? And how should this knowledge inform our thinking? So I'm going to ask each of you here today to really come to the table with an open heart and an open mind. Let's have mutual respect for each other. It's about building relationships, building bridges, and by doing this, we are stronger together. You may not agree with everything. There may be some touchy subjects. This is always a hard conversation. Let's take, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement. You may agree with the overall concept, and I think we all do, that Black lives do matter. You may not agree with everything with the organization. But if we all come together with an open heart and open mind, we can build those bridges and collaborate together. We're not going to go into great detail tonight about biases and privilege. That's for the second webinar, so I hope you all are signing up for that one. But I did want to at least touch on it a little bit. These are our standard Webster Dictionary definitions. Bias being a prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, group compared with another, or privilege, a special right, advantage, or immunity granted to a particular person or group. But what I'd like you to think about as we move through the presentation tonight is where you may have biases or may recognize your own privilege. Many of you can walk into stores and buy the products you want. Though we are seeing a little bit diversity in that space, whether shades of hosiery or shades of cosmetics, I want you to think about going a little more skin deep here and really thinking about how others have advantages or privilege over others. Some of you can move through a store without being followed. You see people that look like you in television, in movies, on stage, in film, or even on the runway. And also, many of you can drive a car without the fear of being pulled over. To add a little fun, and hopefully everyone's awake here, let's do a quick little poll. How many judgments do we make in 7 seconds? A, 2, B, 8, C, 11, D, 15. So if you would check one of the options on the poll and submit your vote. We'll give it a few minutes. And then if we can share the results, that would be great. All right, most of you, it looks like the largest percent said 8. The answer is actually 11. About 23%, which was the next one, said 11. But I think the point is here, and Vivian, if we want to close the poll, and Vivian, go to the next slide. It's the 7-11 rule. We make 11 judgments in 7 seconds. So what I hope we will do tonight is really open up our minds and not assume we know what others are feeling or experiencing. I encourage all of you as we go through this presentation to pay attention to what surprises you. It will help you identify your blind spots, and also to really think about your anti-racism journey. Are you more passive, maybe tolerant, but secretly limiting or excluding people of color? Are you in the changing mode, maybe growing and trying to understand racism better and committing yourself to change? Or are you ready to truly become anti-racist and fully participating in helping to shape an environment that is combating all forms of social oppression? I recently read an essay by Smithsonian Secretary Lonnie G. Bunch, and he said, confront the reality that despite the gains made in the past 50 years, we are still a nation riven by inequality and racial division. And I think this could not be more true. I can't believe we are still having this conversation and the need for this webinar tonight, 50 years later. So let's explore history a little bit. So between 1525 and 1866, 12.5 million people were kidnapped from Africa and sent to the Americas through the transatlantic slave trade. Upon reaching the New World, some 3.9 million, and those were the ones who actually survived the harrowing journey, were enslaved in the United States. We hear stories about Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and other heroes throughout slavery. And of course, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, but it took an additional 2.5 years for it to fully enact, hence Juneteenth. And then in 1916, we had a large percentage of Blacks living in the South, where they were held captive through sharecropping and isolated from the rest of the country. Horrific events like the lynching of 14-year-old Emmett Till, shown in one of the pictures here, in Mississippi in 1955. And then over the years, we saw many Americans start to migrate by the 70s, where 47% of Blacks were now in the North and Western US and called it home. And yet we still had low-paying jobs, redlining, restrictive housing, and widespread discrimination, which gave rise to the Civil Rights Movement. From the Brown versus Board of Education, desegregating public schools, to Rosa Parks with her bus boycott, to the famous march and dream of Martin Luther King, which Vivian will talk about in a little bit. We have the Civil Rights Act outlawing discrimination based on race, color, religion, and more. And we have the Voting Rights Act of 1965, prohibiting racial discrimination in voting. And of course, in 2008, we had the first Black president, Barack Obama, which did not absolve the US of its racist history. Many thought we had arrived. I even thought. I remember as he walked across stage with his beautiful family, crying and really feeling a sense of relief that we had finally made it. It gave me a sense of optimism. However, we know that is not the case today. It was not the post-racial America many of us thought. So here we are today, here after the killing of George Floyd and so many others before him. I'm going to play a video now, and it's called The Choice. It was done by Procter & Gamble. I ask that each of you think about your choice and where you go from here. And following the video, my colleague Vivian Hexter will take us into the next part of our presentation to discuss the Black and Jew relations. Thank you.
With inverted tongue, from whence does fulfillment come? And I expel from this mortal shell, where I die for living up.
Good evening, everyone. It's great to be back in northern New Jersey, where I grew up attending Temple Sinai of Bergen County in Tenafly. I was bat mitzvah and confirmed there, and my mother actually still lives in Englewood. So let's start by talking a little bit about why we as Jews should care about Black-Jewish relations in this country. I'm going to be making assumptions and using generalizations as I move along through my part of the presentation, because that's really the only way to talk about the issues that we're here to talk about this evening. Before I talk about why we should care, I'm going to sort of try to debunk a few myths about why we shouldn't care. So the first is, it's not about history. American Jewish history, in general, is one of rapid ascent, while African American history is one of slavery. We can't really use the sociological explanation. Jews do not experience social marginalization in this country anymore, whereas Blacks definitely do experience it. And finally, it's not the Holocaust, because the Holocaust was terrible, but it's now universally understood to have been terrible, and we study it as such, whereas, and it's over, whereas the oppression of Black people continues in this country. So why should we care? The first reason might be a little bit surprising to some of us. So in the United States, we are a multiracial Jewish community. Fully 20% of us identify as being of color, 10% as being Black. So we are them, they are us. We are one, in a sense. We were once strangers in a strange land. We celebrate every Passover our exodus from Egypt. So we're reminded once a year that we were strangers in a strange land. So as Donna said, we believe in B'Tselem Elohim, so that we're all made in the image of God and that we're therefore sacred. And that's all of us, not some of us, all of us. Very important today is that really, white supremacy is on the ascendant, and both anti-Semitism and racism are aspects of white supremacy. White supremacists use anti-Semitism and racism to further their aims. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, we as Jews know that over millennia, what keeps us safe in our homes, in our communities, in our synagogues, is deep relationships across faith, class, and racial lines. If one group is marginalized, then we are not far from being marginalized. So building deep relationships is really what we're talking about this evening and over the next couple of weeks. And I'd like us to keep that in mind as we go forward. I'm going to begin our little dive into Black Jewish history in the United States with a quiz. So, because I want to be sure that you're all on your toes, it being late in the evening. So, who is this man? And if you think you know who he is, you can put your answer in the Q&A or the chat. I would be surprised if anyone knew who he was, but maybe I'm wrong. So Ariella, can you see if anyone is? Okay, so we have one person who knows who he was. So his name was Judah P. Benjamin. He was a Southern Jew, and in the antebellum South until 1850, he owned a plantation and had 140 slaves. So in 1850, he sold the plantation, but then he went on to become first the Secretary of War of the Confederacy and then the Secretary of State of the Confederacy. And so he was literally at the right hand of Jefferson Davis and the leaders of the Confederacy. I introduced this man because I want us to understand that the history of Jews and Blacks in this country is extremely complicated. It's complex, it's controversial. There are things about it that we may not be crazy about, but there he is, Mr. Benjamin. Let's explore a little bit why and how the Black and Jewish experiences have been so different in this country. As I noted, Mr. Benjamin was a slaveholder, and in the antebellum South, there were plenty of Jews who were slaveholders, also slave traders. They tended to live more in cities and towns, so they owned fewer slaves on average than their plantation counterparts, but they were slaveholders because that's what you did if you were white in the South. Interestingly and importantly, Jews stood up for themselves during the Civil War. In 1862, General Grant issued an order expelling Jews from the military district he commanded, and the Jews got Lincoln to rescind the order. And then they got the laws changed to allow Jewish chaplains to serve in the war. This was a very important moment for Jews in this country, where they were not embarrassed to say we're Jews and we're integrated into society, but we want to begin to stand up for our rights as Jews. Jews in general thrived in the post-Civil War period in both the North and the South. In the South, they were peddlers, and then they established small retail shops and eventually larger department stores. In the North, they were already merchants, like my mother's family. They owned a small department store and a pajama factory in northeastern Pennsylvania. So as merchants and whatever, they were landlords and real estate holders, and often their tenants were Black. You can imagine that this led to many conflicts over time and really has produced a lot of friction between Jews and Blacks. It's also fair to say that by the 1950s, Jews had entered the mainstream of American life. I'll give you an example. My mother entered Wellesley in 1945. In 1945, Wellesley had a Jewish quota. The entering class could only be 10% Jewish. So this lasted another couple of years, and round about 1947, a wealthy alum, I think she may have been a Mrs. Tisch, said, "Oh yes, I know you're asking me for money for your 75th anniversary, Wellesley, which is coming up, but guess what? I'm not going to give you a major gift unless you get rid of that Jewish quota." And guess what? Wellesley got rid of the Jewish quota. And by the middle of the 1950s, Jewish quotas of all types had pretty much disappeared from the United States. And perhaps most importantly, although about 20% of us identify as being of color, the vast majority of us are white and of European extraction. I'm going to spend a little time talking about the civil rights movement because, to a great extent, the way Judaism looks in the United States today, the way it's organized, the way we live, is to a great extent a function of what happened during the civil rights movement and just afterward. And I owe a lot to a book by Professor Mark Dollinger, which is called Black Power, Jewish Politics, for his questioning of the received wisdom about Jews and the civil rights movement. So the received wisdom is that Jews and Blacks had a strong alliance, they never thought it would end, and they were shocked, the Jews were shocked when it did. And I want to use this photo to show you sort of the tension that, that was arising around Jews and the movement. So this is perhaps one of the most famous photos of the movement, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel marching from Selma to Montgomery. But look in the background, and you see there Tepper's department store. So Saul Tepper, who was the owner of the store, was Jewish. He was an ardent segregationist. and fought mightily against the movement all during the 1950s and 1960s. He may not have represented the majority Jewish view in Selma, but he was a prominent figure in the town nonetheless. So you can see the tension between Rabbi Heschel, Saul Tepper, emblematic of the tension overall. We hear a lot about the so-called golden age of Black-Jewish relations from 1955 to 66. And it is absolutely true that many rabbis and other white, mostly Northern Jews joined the movement and went south to register voters, sit at lunch counters, and otherwise engage in civil disturbances. But as we've just seen, these mostly young people did not represent the views of all Jews, and particularly Southern Jews. And some Blacks now argue that there was an element of white savior behavior in those trips to the South. Among the most famous of these young people were Andrew Goodman, for whom a New Jersey-based organization and former client of mine is named, Michael Schwerner, both Jewish, and almost as an afterthought, James Chaney, who was Black. These three young men went south in the summer of 1964 to register voters in Mississippi, the so-called Freedom Summer. And on the first day that they were registering voters, they were murdered by the Ku Klux Klan. Some people argue that the fact that the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Act in particular passed within a year or so of this incident, that this is a function of the fact that two young white men were killed by the Ku Klux Klan, and that therefore the pressure on President Johnson was so great as a result of, and they were not only young white men, they were well-connected young white men, that this really pushed him to push the Senate and Congress to pass the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act the following year. So Dollinger, in his book, makes a convincing argument that prominent Jews, including executives of the Anti-Defamation League, could see that the alliance would end even as it was flourishing. He quotes Nathan Edelstein, then president of the Anti-Defamation League, saying in 1960, "The long-standing African-American distrust of white people, born of oppression, is manifesting itself in a growing spirit of go it alone. Blacks were already reevaluating their alliances and had come to know their strength in the political and economic arenas." Edelstein predicted a period of mutual irritation and misunderstanding, followed by a spike in new and more active forms of Black anti-Semitism. And he was prescient. So that was in 1960. And in 1965-66, along comes Black Power, and Jews are expelled from Black organizations that are working on civil rights. And the two groups, Jews and Blacks, were on separate paths again, or were they? Dollinger argues that the Black Power movement profoundly influenced Judaism in this country, that it was a big factor in the growth of Jewish nationalism among American Jews. If Blacks could be nationalistic, so could Jews. Black nationalism made it okay to be nationalistic and to really stand up for your own group. He points to the huge support for Israel during the Six-Day War of 1967, much greater even than the support when Israel was founded in 1948. So Gallup did a poll of American Jews in 1967, and 97% of them had strong sympathy for Israel. Can you imagine 97% having strong sympathy for Israel today? And so we'll appreciate this. In 1 hour at an event in Manhattan, they raised $18 million for Israel. That's in 1967 dollars. Dollinger also argues that Free Soviet Jewry in the 1970s owed much to the civil rights movement. 1/3 of the Free Soviet Jewry activists were trained in the civil rights movement. And in 1974, there was a freedom ride for Soviet Jews that involved thousands of Jews, evoking the famous freedom rides of the 1960s. Jews became more religious, or at least their children did, often becoming kosher to the dismay of their parents. and not being able to go over to eat at their parents' homes. The second most popular book by the Hebrew Publishing Company in the 1960s was the Jewish Catalog, which was basically how to be Jewish if you're a hippie. The catalog was so popular that it went through 3 editions. There was no need for a 4th, because by that time, the readers had kids of their own and could send them to religious school, Jewish day school, Jewish summer camp. This is probably sounding familiar because the nationalism had spawned a whole bunch of day schools and summer camps and what have you. There was a huge demand for Jewish education. There was even a pray-in at the Jewish Federation in San Francisco in 1967, where the young people went on Shabbat, on Friday night, they went to the Jewish Federation in San Francisco, and they camped out and they refused to leave until the Federation agreed to spend more money on Jewish education. And guess what? The Federation agreed to spend more money on Jewish education. And finally, there was even some Jewish militancy and an abandonment of Dr. King's philosophy of nonviolence by some Jews. Most notably, the Jewish Defense League, which created paramilitary groups to defend in neighborhoods that were changing from Jewish to Black. So we can see that in the mid to late 1960s, American Jews were becoming more American, more Black power than they ever imagined. So the history of the Jews and Blacks since that time it's been a mixed one, again, complicated, often not so happy, perhaps most notably in 1991 in the Crown Heights section of Brooklyn, when a Jewish driver killed a young Black boy and injured the boy's cousin. What followed was 3 days of rioting that many believe ended Mayor David Dinkins' chances at a second term as mayor. So messy from the civil rights movement to today. And that brings us back to the present moment. So what does what we've just learned and Black Lives Matter reveal about Black-Jewish relations today? So maybe, just maybe, we're not as special as we thought when it comes to racism. Maybe we don't have such a special relationship with the Black community. We have the advantage of being white, most of us. We cannot rest on the laurels of the civil rights movement, both because, as we've just seen, there was a complex interaction of Jews and Blacks even then, and it was a long time ago. And for sure, we do not understand what it is to be Black in America. All you have to do is watch the George Floyd video to know that this is true. The bottom line is that we have some soul searching to do, and that is what part 2 of our webinar series on unconscious bias is about. Thank you. With that, I'm going to pass it back to Cheryl.
Thanks so much, Vivian. That was great. So hopefully everything that Vivian discussed really informed your thinking. Hopefully you came away with more of a humble feeling, really opened you up to learning, encouraging you to question history, and preparing you for the next 2 webinars on July 22nd and August 4th. On the 22nd, we'll be discussing unconscious bias and privilege, an interactive program exploring these terms and concepts. And on August 4th, where do we go from here? We'll hear from leaders in the Black community and learn what you can do to help create a more equitable environment. If you want to learn more about some of the things we discussed today, we suggest these readings: Troubling the Waters, Black-Jewish Relations in the American Century, Decolonizing Wealth, and Black Power, Jewish Politics, which Vivian talked about quite a bit, by Mark Dollinger. And to prepare for the next webinar, some additional suggested readings: Waking Up White and Finding Myself in the Story of Race by Debbie Irving, White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism, and When They Call You a Terrorist, a Black Lives Matter memoir. Just wanted to share our contact information. If you have any questions on what we discussed today or need help in any other way, here's our information, both our websites as well as how to contact us. And we'd be happy to open it up for Q&A at this time. So if you want to type in the Q&A section, any questions that you have, and we'll be monitoring those. I see we have a interest in these readings, and we certainly will make sure we share as many of those ahead of the other webinars so that you can do some preparation before the next two webinars. Thank you for that comment.
So someone says, I'm looking for a novel about Jews of color for my Temple's book club. Any suggestions? I will find you one. So Laura H. should get in touch with Ariella, and I will find you a great novel about Jews of color.
And I see a couple people are asking about whether this is being recorded and will be shared later. My understanding is that it is and will be available, I think, in a few days. Thank you for the additional thank yous and comments and wanting to share it with others. That's terrific.
So there's a great question about how do we get Black leaders to stand up against anti-Semitism? Cheryl, any thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, I know there's already quite a bit of work happening with faith leaders. I'm aware there are several meetings taking place right here in New Jersey and across the country. So I think that's certainly a great start. And it's really about listening to each other and building those bridges that we talked about earlier. So I think we'll see more of those kinds of discussions happening so that we understand each other's histories and we understand what each other are facing right now. But I think starting with the faith leaders, I'm seeing it already working, and I think we'll see some positive results from that.
Okay, and I see that someone has this, I think there's a suggestion about a novel about Jews of color called The Color of Love. It sounds very promising. Have you seen the documentary 13th? I have not. Have you, Cheryl?
I haven't, but I am familiar with it, and it is highly recommended by several people. So thanks for suggesting that. I see the Black Lives Matter movement question has come up. As I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, I really think that being able to find what pieces that you feel you connect to, everyone has their own sense of advocacy, whether it's through protesting, whether it's through voting, whether it's through writing, whether it's doing what you're doing tonight and being a part of these discussions. I think you'll see in the next webinar really looking at your biases and privilege and where you are on your journey. So I think, thinking of the Black Lives Matter, as you put in your question, as a whole, and what that means, that you can find your piece that you feel connected to.
And so someone asked, can we tell you more about the Black Jews? So I can say a few words, and then I will say that on our last webinar, the one on August 4th, we hope to have at least one Jew of color on that panel. In fact, we plan to have at least one. What I would say about Black Jews is they are themselves a diverse group. They range from Reform to Orthodox. They live all over the country. And what I understand is that a lot of them you may not see many of them in your synagogues or Federation meetings or JCCs because they feel that the Jewish institutions in general could be more welcoming to Black Jews. So I think we're going to talk more about that going forward. But it's amazing. They are a very diverse group. I think that was sort of the gist of the question.
Yeah, and I'll just add that to that, Vivian. I work with the Jewish Women's Foundation of New Jersey, and one of the things that we often share best practices or talk with the other Jewish Women's Foundations across the country. And I know the one in New York in particular has done some great work, and their model of highlighting various entrepreneurs, they have quite a few Black Jews that they've highlighted. And so if you look at some of their work, you may find some interesting information and connections there.
The atmosphere between Jewish and Black clergy. Cheryl, I don't know what you would say, but I think that it's, I mean, certainly in I live in Manhattan, but in our synagogue, there's a fantastic relationship between Jewish and Black clergy. I don't know, Cheryl, whether you experience the same thing.
Yeah, definitely. And even just through these last months, as I mentioned earlier, just seeing a lot more of that interaction. So I think I totally agree, Vivian.
Mm-hmm.
I saw someone mention about Trevor Noah's response to the murder of George Floyd. I also highly recommend taking a look at that if you haven't already.
Mm-hmm. Jewish slaveholders were mentioned. What about Jewish abolitionists? There were plenty of those as well, particularly in the North, of course. At the moment I can't think of any names, but I could certainly find some. I love the book. I love the book. The question is about Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. I think it's a fabulous book. Just a fabulous book. What resources are available through the JCRC? I'm going to ask that. I'm going to have to turn that over to Ariella, or I was thinking we're among the resources. So I don't know, Ariella, maybe you could put something in the chat about that, or maybe send something out afterwards when we send out the link.
Yeah, and I know many of the federations are starting to do that on their websites, providing various resources. So I definitely would refer to there. Vivian, I don't know if you have a good sense of the difference between Black and Jewish relations in the North versus the South historically.
So I would say, again, if we think of Jews, so that's a very big question, right? So I would say it depends, right? Originally there were some Jewish slaveholders in the North, right? But there weren't many, there were none of those by the time, obviously, that the Civil War came around. And if we think of Jews as being primarily white and often being landlords or real estate holders, both in the South and the North, as Cheryl said, there was right after the Civil War, a lot of Blacks were still in the South, but then over time they moved north, and they encountered Jewish landlords and real estate holders in both places. So I don't know that it's possible to say categorically that there was a difference But I'm happy to think about it and get back to Naomi Knopf, whose name I'm going to write down. Okay.
And I think we, looks like we only have about 10 minutes left, and I know there's some thoughts that will be shared after we finish the Q&A. So I think we'll maybe take one or two more questions, Vivian. I know it was mentioned about the recent news with in the sports of some anti-Semitism that was shared by a football player, and are we aware of any other movements of Blacks and Jews sharing culture and educating each other? I think we're seeing a lot of ideas, especially amongst teens and younger folks coming together and looking for opportunities, whether it is going to museums together, as I know was suggested in this most recent situation. So I think, keeping an eye out for that. I know there's a lot of activity happening and bringing a lot of the youth groups together from both temples and churches.
So I must say, so Cheryl, do you know either of these books?
Let's see.
How Jews Became White Folks, and what that says about race in America, and Shared Dreams?
I don't know that one, but I think what there's a lot of people who are asking about various resources. So I think, we certainly will save this chat and pull them together, and then try to share back with Ariel or others any comments we have or further recommendations, in addition to films and podcasts. And there's so many out there right now.
Mm-hmm. So, and then here's maybe a great question about, with 20% of us identifying as being of color, how do we find these people? So I would refer you to an organization called the Jews of Color Initiative. It's a nonprofit organization, and its sole role is to advocate for Jews of color within the larger Jewish community. And for sure, they will have ideas about where to find Jews of color. So that would be and we'll send out that name also. And with any luck, we'll have the CEO of that organization on our August 4th panel. So Cheryl, should we stop answering questions?
I think so, just so we can be cognizant of everyone's time. This has been an absolutely terrific discussion, and I love seeing all the fabulous questions. I wish we could have gotten to all of them, but happy to do some additional follow-up and get those answers to you. So at this time, I think I will be handing it over to Wendy, but thanks again, and thank you for joining us.
Hi, my name is Wendy Ward, and I am a proud co-chair for tonight's event. I want to thank you all. Oh, did my video start? I'm sorry.
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. So again, I just want to thank you all for joining us on this very important discussion this evening. I mean, Cheryl and Vivian, thank you both for helping us begin this process toward raising our consciousness with this thought-provoking program. By sharing this important history and perspective, I think you've given us such a great foundation so that we can start to take the next steps towards anti-racism. And as Donna said, change can really only happen through listening and learning, and you've given us so much to think about. And I think, the questions have just been great, and this is a three-part series for a reason, and I think the questions just show how interested people are, and a lot of the answers will come in the second and third sessions. So, thank you again. I am a proud supporter of Federation, and it's evenings like this that remind me of why I got involved with the Federation and JCRC in the first place. For me, it's all about tikkun olam, acts of kindness and repairing the world. and it's all about helping others. And our programs range from the educational, like we've had this evening, to events that are more hands-on, such as upcoming Supplies for Success, where we're going to be packing and distributing 1,800 new backpacks for elementary and age children in need. And if you have already made a donation to Federation, I want to say thank you on behalf of all of those who will benefit from your generosity. And if you haven't, please consider joining me.
We have a short interruption there, but thank you all for joining us this evening. Again, I'll just echo, my name is Ariella Novak. I am the JCRC, which is the Jewish Community Relations Committee Director. And I want to really thank Vivian and thank Cheryl for spending not just countless time on this program right now, but countless hours working on it before the program. So we look forward to our next program, which will be taking place next Wednesday evening, which is on July 22nd at 8 p.m. We hope you will be there. And although we can't see you, we're thinking about what you look like, and we look forward to your seeing your questions answered. We'll be sending out a thank you email for everybody who attended, and we'll put in there the book suggestions, etc. And if there's something that you guys are looking to have, we will also include that in the thank you. And with that said, Wendy is back on. Go ahead.
Hello.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm so sorry. Okay, this is my first time doing a Zoom meeting and I'm challenged. But again, thank you. Everything that can go wrong on a in-home Zoom call. As I said, I just wanted to thank everyone again for coming. And as I said, I'm a proud supporter of Federation, and the funds that are behind Federation help those in so many different ways. I encourage you to please consider joining me and so many others in supporting the essential work that Federation does each and every day. If you're interested in getting involved with JCRC, or if you'd just like to learn more about the many programs that we have serving the greater community, please feel free to reach out to us. Again, I want to thank you for taking the time to participate in this program. We are really looking forward to seeing you all next week on Wednesday, July 22nd at 8 p.m. for the second part of this three-part series, where we will be unpacking our unconscious bias and privilege. We will be exploring these terms and concepts with a very special program that will allow us to be even more interactive. And we'll certainly start answering a lot of the questions that we raised today. Tonight's webinar, as you have asked, has been recorded, and we'll be sending you a link over the next week so that you can rewatch it and share this valuable information with friends and family that weren't able to be here this evening. And we will absolutely be sending out a link for the suggested reading list. So thank you all. Please stay safe. Thanks for putting up with my technological difficulties, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you very much.
Good night.
Good night. Oh.